All right. Welcome, everyone. We're going to start. I know some people will probably trickle in a little bit later, but I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Chris Smith is an Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Toronto. Prior to that, she was an Assistant Professor at UC Davis. Her research areas include crime and inequality, organized crime, gender, violence, urban sociology, and more. She employs a variety of research methods to investigate these topics, including social network analysis, historical research methods, spatial analysis, and statistical modeling. Chris's book, Syndicate Women, Gender Networks in Chicago Organized Crime, was published at the University of California Press in 2019. It provides a historical social network analysis of gender, illicit markets, and organized crime from Chicago's Prohibition era. In addition, Chris has published her research in top sociology and criminology journals, including the American Sociological Review, Criminology, and Social Problems. In support of her research, Chris has been the recipient of multiple large grants, including from NSF, NIJ, and Canada's Social Science and Humanities Research Council. Her current book project, on which I'm a collaborator, is called Vice for Sale. It examines and compares the illicit markets of sex work, marijuana dealing, and unlicensed gambling in Chicago and Toronto over the latter part of the 20th century until 2025 or so. This analysis will explore how legal changes affect these markets and the neighborhoods in which these activities occur by drawing on arrests and census tract data. So today's talk will just focus on a sliver of some of the findings from this larger project. And unless there are clarification questions in the talk, I ask that you please wait until the end we'll have a Q&A together. So let's welcome Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon, and thanks for coming out today. Thank you for having me. This is my first time at UC Riverside after about 4 years in California, so it's great to be here. I'm pretty sure this is the only slide where the first letter gets cut off on the left, but if you need a clarification on a missing word, let me know, and I will try to provide that for you. So I have about a 30-minute talk prepared. I am going to be talking about Toronto and Chicago during those most of those 30 minutes, but I did try to add some California context toward the end, so we can kind of think about what do the findings from Canada and Illinois tell us about California. And today I'm going to be showing how these local dispensary markets have developed in relation to policy and what it might mean for these neighborhoods in Chicago and Toronto, and then we can think about that in California context as well. Here's a preview of the research questions that I'm going to be reviewing today. I'm going to be looking mostly at three comparisons, a comparison between the cannabis dispensaries in Chicago, the cannabis dispensaries in Toronto, but also we have found some new data on magic mushroom dispensaries in Toronto that don't exist in Chicago and provide us a way to kind of push the argument and the analysis a little bit further. So this project attempts to bring together two criminological literatures that tend not to overlap. The first is crime in place. This literature largely builds on routine activities theory, and it focuses on places as crime generators or crime attractors. Crime generating places have large groups or crowds of people where motivated offenders come into potential contact with what they would call suitable targets. Examples of crime-generating places would include public transit, entertainment districts, sports stadiums, not places that necessarily crime could happen, but there's more opportunities in which crime could happen. The other side of the crime in place theory talks about crime attracting places. These are established places that have reputations for criminal activity, and intending offenders go to these places for the purpose of crime. So for example, here, red light districts, gambling dens, or drug corners. In this vein of criminology, the focus shifts from the people committing the crimes to the micro places where those crimes occur and why they occur there. A few studies have looked at cannabis dispensaries as crime-generating places, and these studies have investigated whether or not concentration of dispensaries generates local neighborhood crime rates or has an effect on those local crime rates in that neighborhood. The studies have actually showed mixed findings. A few of the studies show that the dispensaries or a concentration of dispensaries do increase local crime rates. Some of the studies show a decrease, and some of the studies show no findings at all, or no significant effects on the crime rates. But in our work, Vice for Sale, we want to think about the other side of this theory. What if we thought about dispensaries as potential crime attractors? These are places with reputations for criminalized activity. And here, the illicit markets literature advances this line of inquiry. So Beckert and Dewey's book, The Architecture of Illegal Markets, situates illegality within economic sociology to understand illegal market exchanges and the social organization of illicit markets. Here, we can conceptualize each dispensary as a node in a neighborhood's illicit market, and this allows us to consider the legal, quasi-legal, and illegal relationships between property owners, business owners, managers, workers, and customers. So cannabis legalization requires jurisdictional layers of rules and regulations. And the illicit markets literature will allow us to pose questions such as, are these dispensaries in compliance? Under what conditions are these market exchanges legitimate? And under which are they illicit? Some examples of the regulative conditions affecting cannabis dispensaries, though not necessarily unique to dispensaries, are unregulated products on shelves, miscalculated distances from nearby schools on commercial leases, customers' on-site consumption, expired licenses, and cashless ATMs. So if a dispensary and its market exchanges are a site of illegality, then we should be thinking about these places as crime attracting. Intending offenders meet at these storefronts for a criminalized purpose. So you might be thinking, cannabis is legalized, these market actors aren't offenders, these exchanges aren't criminalized. But today I want to show you that's only mostly yes, and only in some very certain contexts, yes. Today I'll show you that the architecture of these markets are so highly regulated that multiple laws and regulations are easily violated and sometimes defiantly violated. These neighborhood drug dispensaries operating as local organizations and workplaces have obscured the illegality of their market participation, but this does vary over time and jurisdiction. So we are looking at Chicago and Toronto in this study. We chose these studies because they're comparable in size. The population of Chicago is 2.7 million people. The population of Toronto is 3 million people. The cities are about the same size spatially, so they have similar population density. They're only about 515 miles apart. Chicago does have almost double the tourists that Toronto does, and it has about a 50% larger metropolitan area. But we found that in terms of finding comparable cases, we think that these two are working pretty well, and some other scholars have leveraged these comparisons in their research. The reason why we need comparable size cities is we want to find a place where we could expect similar market demand for cannabis or other drugs. We also found that between Chicago and Toronto, opinions favoring marijuana legalization are similarly high in both cities. So these aren't perfect comparison polls, but they show us some of this high favorability. In 2016, a poll showed that 89% of Chicagoans favored legalizing medical marijuana. In 2016, a poll showed that 82% of Torontonians supported legalizing cannabis in Canada. And then there was a 2018 ballot initiative in Chicago in which 63% of Chicagoans voted to legalize marijuana. So again, what we have are comparable cities in terms of size, comparable in terms of attitudes about cannabis, and we argue likely comparable in their market demands for cannabis. But importantly, they're situated in two different socio-legal contexts around the legalization and timing of cannabis. Okay, this one's not too cut off. So here's a timeline of these shifting legal landscapes in Illinois and Canada, and of the cannabis dispensaries first appearing in Chicago and Toronto. I'll point out a couple of the comparisons here. You can see in 2001, Canada was one of the first countries to create a medical marijuana program for severely ill patients. That didn't happen until 12 years later in Illinois, in 2013, when Illinois authorized a program for the cultivation and dispensing of medical marijuana. You can see on this timeline also that Chicago gets its first licensed medical marijuana dispensary in 2015. Medical marijuana dispensaries were never licensed in Toronto, so we didn't have those appearing during our medicalization period. You can also see that recreational cannabis was legalized 2 years apart, but the dispensaries started appearing 1 year apart. I have nothing on this timeline on magic mushrooms because nothing has shifted in their criminalization or legalization. So when we're talking about illicit markets, we're also thinking about the legality across jurisdictional levels that impact the drug dispensaries. Chicago has had a law on the books discrepancy in legality since 2020, when the state of Illinois legalized recreational cannabis and licensed the dispensaries. And if you've been paying attention, you might be wondering, didn't Donald Trump just change all of this last month? And I did have to update my notes in this part of my slide. In December, Trump issued an executive order directing the Attorney General to reschedule marijuana from a Schedule 1 substance to a Schedule 3. And that would allow medical testing and research testing. It wouldn't legalize recreational cannabis. It doesn't legalize a sale, but it would change the medical uses of it. So far, this red X in federal legality is true as of yesterday when I double checked my notes, but I realize it's a quickly moving target on that one. Okay, so we have federal legality and then state legality, federal illegality and state legality for cannabis in Chicago. In Toronto, we have a couple different things going on. So Toronto had a short discrepancy in 2018 when Canada legalized recreational cannabis sales, but left the provinces to regulate and license the dispensaries. And Ontario decided at first to only allow recreational cannabis to be sent through the mail and didn't have storefronts. There weren't businesses. That changed in 2019, where we have a match in the jurisdictional levels, where Ontario created a lottery system where 5 cannabis dispensaries got to open in Toronto. The mushroom dispensaries are prohibited at both the federal level and the provincial level in Canada, so there's no legal discrepancy there. And the reason why I lay these out in this way is I want to show that of these 4 legal contexts, only cannabis dispensaries in Toronto since 2019 could be operating within a fully legalized market, but actually many aren't. Another way of stating this is that dispensaries in all these contexts include some illicit market participation. So here's a reminder of the research questions. And so now you're starting to see what am I talking about when I'm talking about types of legality. And I'll be kind of showing you, reminding you of this slide and these discrepancies, because it can be a lot of dates to keep track of. Let me preview a few of the hypotheses that speak to these research questions. So we look at size in this study, and we're measuring size as the number of dispensaries within each city. And so here it's reasonable to hypothesize that we would have fewer dispensaries under the full prohibition model and the most dispensaries under the full legalization model. We have similar hypotheses to stability. We measure stability as the growth of the market, how quickly it grows, and the duration of how long the dispensaries stay open, what's the turning or the churning. And here we also are predicting least stability in the fully prohibited market and the most stability in the fully legalized market. Orientation toward the law, we're thinking about as compliance or non-compliance across these jurisdictional levels. So here we hypothesize more compliance with state and provincial laws and regulations, kind of thinking that the dispensaries and the actors are closest to the law enforcers. And then we would hypothesize less compliance with federal law. Across these hypotheses, that's mostly what we find in the study, but there are some deviations that I will be showcasing in the findings. So we had 3 focuses of the data collection. Lexi was a big part of this back in the day. So 2 cities, 3 types of data collection for each city. The main thing I'm going to be presenting today are these digital footprints. So we tried to find the histories of these dispensaries in Chicago and Toronto. We used formal business directories. We used Google Maps. We used web searches. One of the challenges with data collection is these illicit and unlicensed dispensaries are harder to find. but we actually found a lot. So it was kind of a surprising, like, oh, it's out there. It might be, it's harder to find, but it's there. So that's mostly what we're looking at in terms of our questions about size and stability. I also am going to show you some layers of police data, especially around how police have been making arrests for cannabis dealing. So I don't have possession arrests today, it's just those cannabis dealing arrests. The dates don't perfectly line up because we're trying to expand this project into the last 5 years because so much has been changing in the dispensary market. And I'll be showing you these data at the census tract level using the most recent census tract boundaries for Toronto and Chicago. So let's start with the findings from Chicago. Dispensary 33 was the first medical marijuana dispensary in Chicago. It opened in 2015, as I showed on that timeline. 4 years later, in 2019, Governor Pritzker signed the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act, which declared that Illinois would regulate cannabis like it regulates alcohol starting on January 1st, 2020. So how has federal illegality and state legality shaped the size and stability of Chicago's cannabis dispensary market? We find that this is a small sized market. We identified 46 dispensaries over 10 years in Chicago using our digital footprint data collection methods. There were 44 marijuana dispensaries operating as of 2025. We also find that this is a pretty stable growth. You can see the line kind of just follows kind of a normal pattern upward. Since 2020, the average has been about 5 dispensaries opening per year. We find that the turnover in this market is low. Only 2 dispensaries have closed in Chicago, one of which was open for 4 years and one of which was open for 2 years. And 10 of the locations have changed their names, where they had like kind of a medical marijuana themed name, and then they've changed the name to be more recreational marijuana. So like herbal health dispensary turns into Zen Leaf or something like that. So small but stable is what we're finding in Chicago. Here is a map of the 46 dispensaries in Chicago. It includes the 2 that have closed. I'll show you where downtown Chicago is in case you're not familiar. It's kind of right up in here where that little cluster of dots is on the east side. That's on Lake Michigan. What you see is a little bit of concentration of dispensaries in downtown Chicago, but overall the licensing is pretty spread out. Most neighborhoods don't have dispensaries. You might have to travel far to get to one. What is this market's orientation toward the law? All of these dispensaries appear to be licensed. There appears to be a very strict compliance with the state law and the Chicago regulations. We dug hard trying to find stories of arrests or raids on these dispensaries, and we could not find them in Chicago for these dispensaries. The arrest data, again, is a little bit older than some of the dispensaries existed. The west side of Chicago and the south side of Chicago tend to have higher socioeconomic disadvantage, higher crime rates, and you'll see that that's kind of where the only arrests for cannabis dealing were taking place, nowhere near where the dispensaries are located. So we take this to mean that Illinois and Chicago appear to be maintaining tight control of the cannabis dispensary market. Here's a little longer view of the Chicago police data over 20 years. Again, these are the cannabis dealing arrests. It's a pretty jagged line. It looks like it changes quite a bit year to year. But I do think it's interesting that the peak is in 2018. So that's after medical marijuana was legalized in 2015, but before the full legalization or the state legalization model in 2020. Also note here, when I show you Toronto, this axis goes to 1750, and the Toronto line graph is about half of this one. So many more arrests in Chicago than the comparison in Toronto. So we have a pretty nice, tidy story about Chicago. That is not the case in Toronto. Toronto is referred to as the Wild West of marijuana shops, even in this fully legalized market. So how does legality shape the size and stability of Toronto's cannabis dispensary market? Here we found digital footprints of 245 cannabis dispensaries in Toronto. And again, the timeline here is a little bit weird. Remember that in 2018, we get national legalization. The province allowed there to be dispensaries in 2019, but Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party, when they got elected in 2015, said they were going to legalize cannabis. So we have full prohibition up to 2018, this 2015 to 2018 kind of limbo period, and then that 1-year gap between the national level and provincial level decisions. So we only found digital footprints of 2 dispensaries before 2015 when Trudeau announced legalization interests. The earliest one that we found was for 1 dispensary in 2009, but the owner of that one told a newspaper that they'd been in Toronto since 1996. They just kind of kept moving around. We couldn't find any trace of it online, of an address until 2009. In 2018 to 2019, that 1 year where we had federal legality and provincial illegality, we're actually thinking there's a medium-sized market going on during that period, but our data is underestimating it. We only found digital footprints of 11 dispensaries during that time, but city officials were estimating 75 to 100 illegal dispensaries operating before the province legalized the dispensaries. So what seemed to be going on is the illegal dispensaries weren't creating websites, there weren't Google reviews of them, they weren't showing up online in a way that we could track with our methods. From 2019 to 2025, we have the full legalization period. Here we see a large size. We think we have a lot better data here, but it looks like we're still getting a little bit of underestimation. A lot of the reports are saying there's more like 250 to 300 dispensaries in in Toronto. We found 185 operating as of 2025. We also referred to this as an unstable growth in Toronto. We see the growth surge here. In 2020, Ontario lifted its cap on dispensaries, and about 28 have opened each year since 2020. There's high turnover and high closures. About a dozen dispensaries have closed each year since 2020, and 20 dispensaries have changed names, possibly owners. It's a little bit tricky to track. Here is a map of the 245 cannabis dispensaries in Toronto. This includes the 60 that have permanently closed. There's a high concentration of them in downtown Toronto, which is this area here. And if you notice, there's a few kind of straight-looking lines here, and then there's a diagonal here. Those are actually really popular streetcar lines in Toronto. So if you're riding the streetcar, you're like, dispensary, 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 like every couple blocks. So what is this market's orientation toward the law? During the legalization limbo, again, as I mentioned, city officials were estimating 75 to 100 illegal dispensaries. There were weekly raids before legalization, and the mayor described this period as the Wild West, with dispensaries spreading like wildfire. Since legalization, we argue there's an asymmetric orientation toward the law. Most of these dispensaries since legalization are in compliance, but a minority of businesses are unlicensed. They've been raided, shuttered, and fined. Bylaw officers report successful convictions of 116 unlicensed dispensaries in the past 5 years. And notice that I said bylaw officers because the city has put this, they're using their own workers to enforce the rules and regulations rather than having the police focus on the dispensaries. Here's a longer look at Toronto's cannabis dealing arrests since 1992. As I mentioned, to note the y-axis here, the Chicago y-axis went up to 1750, and this one only goes up to 1,000, so almost half the size of arrests. There's no way to tell if these arrests were in the dispensaries themselves. But you can see a little increase between 2015 and 2016 at the beginning of that legalization limbo, and then we have a big drop-off after the full legalization in 2019. However, we're kind of racking our brains over why the legalization arrest numbers are so similar to the arrest numbers in the 1990s, and that we're not sure what's going on. It's probably just like what the police were prioritizing that year. It could be a data recording issue. It's hard to tell. And then something started popping up in Toronto, and I was like, we have to change our paper. We have to think about a whole nother side of illicit markets, one that is not hiding in plain sight. So in Canada, psilocybin is regulated under the Controlled Drugs and Substance Act like it is here in the US. There have been no changes in the criminalization of magic mushrooms in Canada. The only thing that changed was that in 2022, Health Canada granted a special access program for experimental treatments of magic mushrooms. About 300 patients in the entire country have been granted access. And also in 2022, these started appearing in Toronto. This has caused a lot of confusion about the legal status of magic mushrooms in Canada. Some of these magic mushroom dispensaries have websites, some of them have mail order options, they have explanations and instructions on how to use magic mushrooms. They have some of the highest ratings you'll ever see on Google Maps. One of them has like 3,500 reviews on Google. But again, we want to ask our question. So how does federal illegality, provincial illegality, our full prohibition model, shape the size and stability of Toronto's mushroom dispensary market? So this is the little gray line on the bottom. It's the smallest in size. We have identified 30 illegal mushroom dispensaries in Toronto, the first appearing in 2022, and there were 20 operating as of 2025. This is also unstable. The turnover is very high. Half of the dispensaries have been open for less than a year, and several chains have taken over some of the locations. Here's a map of the 30 magic mushroom dispensaries in Toronto. This includes the 10 that have closed. We are also mostly concentrated in downtown Toronto, where you sell those cannabis dispensaries. I am presenting the arrest data from marijuana dealing because I don't have arrest data for magic mushroom dealing. So I just wanted you to have that consistent layer there. So what is this market's orientation toward the law? This is complete defiance of federal and provincial law. Every dot on this map is an illegal dispensary. They have faced multiple high-profile Ontario and citywide raids. A spokesperson for one of the dispensaries called Fun Guys told Toronto Star in a 2024 interview that over 120 police raids had targeted its various Ontario locations. Workers have been arrested, owners have fled the country, but this market persists. This is a photo from my neighborhood in Toronto. On average, the mushroom dispensaries are about 0.14 miles from the nearest cannabis dispensary, but some of them are next door, like you can see in this photo. There's a magic mushroom dispensary on the left and a cannabis dispensary on the right. So two illicit market businesses next door to each other in my neighborhood with the lights on. As a criminologist, like this is gold for me. But interestingly, this cannabis dispensary, it's called Alpha Bud Cannabis, is not licensed by the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario. I know because I looked it up and it's nowhere on their map. So here we have one unlicensed business and then one completely illegal business. Okay, so lots of descriptive findings here, and here's a table of how I'm putting them all together. Size mostly fit our predictions. Mushroom dispensaries in Toronto were the smallest market, and cannabis dispensaries in Toronto during legalization were the largest. However, police and news reports, not our data, suggest that the cannabis dispensary market in Toronto during the legalization limbo was bigger than the cannabis dispensary market in Chicago with its jurisdictional discrepancy. Stability did not fit our predictions in the hypotheses. Chicago cannabis dispensaries were the only case we have found of market stability. Our hypotheses also predicted lower compliance to federal law and higher compliance to state and provincial law. This was true for Chicago, but it was not true for Toronto. Chicago cannabis dispensaries market appeared to have a restrained orientation toward the law, adhering its compliance to Illinois law and regulation and avoiding interactions with local police. This orientation also has a delicate assumption that the federal government does not plan to intervene or enforce federal drug law. When legalization was pending in Canada, cannabis dispensaries in Toronto took a preemptive orientation toward the law, openly defying the law while waiting for the law to change. This illegal market knew that public opinion supported it, and political leaders weren't up for the challenge. This preemptive orientation also describes Toronto dispensaries in 2018 when the national law legalized recreational marijuana, but Ontario had not licensed dispensaries. During full legalization, we see an asymmetrical orientation toward the law, where the majority of dispensaries and chains are in compliance, but a minority openly defy the law, refusing licensing or offering consumption areas. This asymmetrical orientation most likely comes from market oversaturation. Lastly, we refer to the mushroom dispensaries as having a speculative orientation toward the law, maybe even just wishful thinking. Entrepreneurs are trying to make the same play as cannabis did pre-legalization, but without those federal political commitments. We also had that question of how have these markets changed neighborhoods? Cannabis dealing arrests have gone down in both cities since legalization, but arrests were always much lower in Toronto than they ever were in Chicago. And the biggest declines in arrests started prior to legalization. So the arrest rates were going down before the state and provincial laws changed. Chicago cannabis dealing arrests are highest in highly policed, high crime neighborhoods, nowhere near the dispensaries. Toronto dispensaries have changed the commercial districts in the city. It's easier to find cannabis in some of Toronto's neighborhoods than groceries or wine. Shuttered and closed dispensaries with old signage and no new tenants scatter down busy commercial streets. Toronto's unlicensed cannabis dispensaries and illegal mushroom dispensaries are prime examples of crime attractors operating in plain sight. So this is an unraveling of the organization of these illicit markets. We found dozens of business owners willing to take on legal risk in the pursuit of profit. This has implications for workers, possibly customers, and certainly neighborhoods. So I want to spend a couple of minutes thinking about these findings from Illinois and Ontario in the context of California. So if we consider California, cannabis dispensaries currently face the same jurisdictional legal discrepancy that we see in Illinois. Cannabis is a Schedule I substance, and there's no federal law permitting recreational marijuana possession, consumption, distribution, or sales. California did have a short legalization limbo, similar to Ontario's, when in 2016, California voters passed Prop 64 legislation that legalized recreational cannabis use. In 2018, licensed dispensaries opened as cities figured out their regulations and licensing. Though I think I read 85% of municipalities in California don't license cannabis dispensaries. I'm not sure if that number is correct or not, though. So we see a little bit over a year between Prop 64 and the licensed dispensaries. So if the Toronto pattern applies, local markets during this time would have been medium in size and unstable with a preemptive orientation toward the law. And I actually did live in California during that time. And I remember sort of these popping up and we're like, it's not legal yet, right? Like not kind of that uncertainty, like, is it legal? I need to double check. That's kind of that uncertainty that these dispensaries are creating in communities. In terms of magic mushrooms, they are criminalized at the federal level and the state level in California. So we have the full prohibition model. And so imagine my surprise as I'm telling people about my Toronto findings and we have these magic mushroom dispensaries and people say, oh yeah, we have those in California. I'm like, what? You do? How? How's that happening? So they do exist here, but they're not legal. It's very similar to what's going on in Toronto, it looks like. So in 2022, San Francisco passed a resolution to deprioritize law enforcement investigations and arrests of magic mushroom users. But like Toronto, entrepreneurs are taking a very speculative or wishful thinking orientation toward the law in hopes that public support might dissuade law enforcement. The dispensaries in San Francisco are referring to themselves as churches. They're getting raided and they're causing a lot of confusion for the customers and also for law enforcement and city officials. So based on the Toronto findings, these local markets are likely to be small and unstable. Okay, so what are the policy implications in this research? If jurisdictions want to minimize illicit market responses, legalization, regulation, and licensing should occur as closely together as possible. This seems to explain Chicago's restrained orientation toward the law. Legalization models are coinciding with decreasing arrests, meaning that fewer policing resources are directed at cannabis dealing. But this also coincides with defiant risk-taking entrepreneurs opening illegal and or unlicensed dispensaries with city officials frustrated on how to respond. Illicit markets don't go away with legalization, new loopholes are exploited, and new regulations are violated. Thank you so much for your attention. This is certainly a work in progress, and myself especially, but Sharon also would welcome any questions or suggestions on how we could develop this research further.
Like the investor here. That would be wonderful, thank you. And you can just call on whomever. So who would like to start with the question? Or comment.
Or suggestion.
Or suggestion.
My own.
Yeah.
I was wondering, do Toronto and Chicago have the same like punishment system for unlicensed dispensaries? And if so, would that have an effect on?
Yeah, well, we didn't find any unlicensed dispensaries in Chicago, so it's a little bit tricky to make a perfect comparison. The unlicensed dispensaries in Toronto, they are being raided, but they're closed for like a weekend and then they're opening back up on Monday. Like it's so that there is enforcement, but it's not having like a long-term effect. Interestingly, in Chicago, what's going on is a lot of the unlicensed, unregulated piece of the illicit market is around hemp-derived THC products, where you can go into a gas station or a grocery store or a bar and buy these like 100 or 1,000 milligram THC beverages that are completely unregulated. So a lot of the municipal enforcement right now is on what to do with these hemp-derived THC products that are not legal. But during the 2018 Farm Bill, during the first Trump administration, the Farm Bill declassified hemp-derived THC from Schedule 1, not legalizing its synthesis, not legalizing its distribution or its sale, but creating this kind of awkward space where a lot of entrepreneurs are making beverages and edibles and trying to sell them at convenience stores. So if you've been in one of these states where you see products usually behind a glass case, and you're like, is that legal? Not exactly. But so that's where Chicago is kind of trying to figure out enforcement.
I see. Thank you.
Thanks for that question.
So sorry.
Hello, thank you very much, Chris. Very interesting results.
Thank you.
I'm Pete. I'm the PhD candidate from the economics department. And I'm interested I wonder whether you have the arrest results separated by age. Because I'm thinking about this in a context of, for example, I'm working on a research dealing with tobacco 21 laws. And how does this legalization of cannabis work with other policies like tobacco policy? And do you see any substitutes between cannabis and tobacco? And basically, how does that differs by age group?
Yeah,
Thank you.
I wish that our arrest data were that detailed. Our arrest data it's pretty chunky. We get the type of arrest, and in Toronto, we get the census tract and a date. So there's no other description. They're not letting us have any information on the person arrested or the group of people. So we can't look at it by age. Chicago, they also strip all the demographics out of their publicly available data. So we can really only kind of do this spatial analysis over time with what we have. The only thing that your comment that I can speak to with your question is how the magic mushroom dispensaries are self-regulating around age, right? So again, these are completely illegal businesses, but they have 19 plus signs on their doors. 19 is the legal drinking and smoking age in Canada. And so it's really interesting that they're like, look how good we are at self-regulation. We're like checking ID. I'm like, but it's illegal, right? So yeah, but certainly I'm not sure who's getting like in terms of the arrest. The other thing I would just say is what I've seen in the newspaper reports around the arrests are really around the workers. And this does tend to be a younger group. So there's a big case right now in Toronto of like, I think the young man was like 20 when he was arrested, and like as a drug trafficker because he was working a weekend shift at one of these marijuana dispensaries. And so there's been a lot of like opinion pieces and reports about like what this arrest means for this young person's life. But I wish I had more detailed arrest data. It would be so nice to slice it up better. Thank you.
So, Chris, thanks for visiting us.
Thank you.
I had a question about the zoning requirements on where they can be located. I know from the Seattle context, in Seattle, they had to be a certain distance from schools and parks, and that created actually very limited places where they could be, and they tended to be the sketchiest areas of town, places with strip clubs, prostitution, but also some industrial places with not a lot of population at night. And so that itself, I could imagine, created some kinds of effects on local neighborhoods just by them being located maybe in areas that were multipliers for crime.
Yeah, that's a great question. And in Chicago, I looked at the zoning rules, and I'm trying to remember some of the specifics, and I'm drawing a blank on some. I know there was one about schools and parks, and that there has been some pushback on the landowners, like the whoever has that commercial real estate, misrepresenting their distances to schools and parks in their leases, right? So thinking about how these real estate owners who are renting out these properties are kind of complicit in these in the illicit part of this market, right? In Toronto, though, they're just everywhere. So these are not sketchy neighborhoods. I mean, certainly there are some, right? They're so spread out, but they're in our really popular commercial districts where you get a lot of foot traffic, a lot of streetcar traffic. They're kind of in like these hipper neighborhoods where you would get like lots of restaurants and bars, like thrift stores kind of things. And so the sort of neighborhood feel in Toronto, especially in these popular neighborhoods, is just abundance. Like they're just everywhere. There was one interview in a newspaper where an owner of a head shop, right? So selling pipes and rolling papers, but not yet cannabis, had applied to convert her store into a cannabis dispensary, and her paperwork got wrapped up for a few years in 2020. And she was so thankful that she didn't get the license because there were 3 that opened up on her block on Queen Street West, right? So here, it's just like this totally oversaturated market right now. And I think when Sharon and I started this project, we were thinking about these sort of sketchy neighborhoods. If you look at like where strip clubs are allowed to be in neighborhoods, or adult video stores back in the 90s, we're looking at those as well. Like those aren't in your really popular commercial touristy districts, but that's not holding so true for the cannabis dispensaries. But I'm going to put a star on that one because I do need to look a little bit closer into this, because that is data we actually could get and put on these maps. Thanks for that question.
Thank you so much, Chris. Really fun to learn about this project. I've known about it in name for years, but it was great to really get the deep dive.
You.
I have 2 questions, one clarifying, one substantive. You were talking about the sort of bylaw officers that were doing enforcement, and that was in Toronto, correct?
Yes.
Remind me, apologies, I forgot. They're not obviously going after licensed cannabis dispensaries. They're sort of enforcing for which type of store?
Yeah, so they're basically like city clerks, like people working for the city of Toronto. They are going into licensed dispensaries to check the licenses, to inspect the products on that the shelves are like, because in Canada, all growing and distribution is at the national level, right? So I think it's overseen by some special office in the Canadian government that all of our products are coming from this one place. So they're checking to see that people are checking IDs, that in Toronto, you can't have like open windows. You can't be allowed to see into a dispensary. So they're making sure that your windows are wrapped. Checking to make sure that the people working are of age. So they are going into all of them. but then they find the violators, right? And some of these violators are defiant. So, for example, there's a few dispensaries in Toronto called it's Medicine Wheel of the Mississauga, and it's Indigenous owned. And so they are very defiant in their right to operate outside of Canadian law. They're saying, like, this is stolen territory, you don't have the right to govern us. So those are ones that have been raided a lot. Their products are being taken, even though much of their product is the same exact Canadian approved product, but because they don't have the license. But some of the bylaw officers, like over the summer, they're quite scared, right? Like they're going into these spaces, they're city clerks, they're like, we have to, you have to shut down. And then the owners are like, no. And so it's really causing a lot of tension. And our mayor actually last summer, when I was trying to get all this, the first pass on these results together, she was gonna just freeze the whole program because it had just gotten so out of control. We have so many unlicensed dispensaries in Toronto. The city clerks don't want to do it, and the Toronto police aren't willing to do it. So we're kind of last I checked, we're at a bit of a standstill, and the funding was going to get pulled. But yeah, so technically the bylaw officers should be looking at all of them about compliance, but they're finding a lot of non-compliance.
Okay. So out of curiosity then, was there a period of time where that enforcement was still handled by police? Yes. And if so, do you notice a difference in any sort of your outcomes of interest in sort of the period immediately preceding this sort of movement to the bylaw officers?
I think this slide would be the best to answer that question, right? So again, the Ontario program starts in 2019. And so that huge drop off right there is where, I mean, it also corresponds with legalization. So it could be the shifting of the office, like who's responsible, but it also could be it's legal now and people have access to legal sales of cannabis. So it's probably a little bit of both going in that big drop from 2018 to 2019. But it is also worth noting, and again, we're working on requesting 5 more years of data because we started doing this project, we're like, oh wow, this is so interesting. And then in the cannabis market, everything is happening here after 2020. So unfortunately, we don't quite have the timeline here that we want, but arrests are still happening, right? And so in Chicago, it looks like those arrests are still happening in those poorer neighborhoods, those higher crime neighborhoods where you might have a drug dealing corner and they're just selling illegal marijuana on like outside of a dispensary. Here, I'm not sure if that's exactly what's going on in Toronto. I think the police have really kind of moved away from those types of arrests. So this might be like where the police do have to be called for some of the dispensaries. It's hard to know though. Like again, the data are so thin in terms of what they're providing us. Thanks.
Okay, you can go next.
I have a follow-up to your slide that showed in Chicago, most of the dispensaries were downtown and not in the south and west sides.
Right.
I wonder if you could speak to that. Was that because of the regulatory process? Was it community concerns? I know there's some low-income communities that complain, hey, we can't get a supermarket in here, but we're full of liquor stores and short-term hotels and...
Right. I mean, and I think this goes to your question as well, like what exactly are the zoning? I mean, in downtown Chicago, again, this is that kind of like touristy commercial district. They just kind of fit in with your like t-shirt shop or your convenience store. The diagonal up to the northwest is... that's like follows Milwaukee Boulevard. And so you get Milwaukee Avenue, which is like some of the most famous gentrifying neighborhoods in Chicago. So it's like Wicker Park. I think like the Ukrainian Village is up there. And so that's just kind of this very like more affluent, hip, like, and lots of like fun restaurants and storefronts. I read mixed things about the dispensaries being on the south side and the west side. So certainly there are some older people who did not want them, and they made the argument like you just said. They're like, we need a grocery store first. There's also been a lot of pushback though, where especially in Chicago, the program for licensing is meant to especially boost interest for like Black owners, people from low-income communities. They're really people who have had records from possession records around marijuana prior. They're really trying to like uphold their like those values are written into the policy. And so there's also a lot of reports of Chicago entrepreneurs wanting to get a license and not being able to get it and not being able to get it into their community. So I think both are going on. There's probably a lot of tension, again, sort of like the not in my backyard versus like, why are we being left out? Yeah, but thanks. I'm going to make a note of that question too, because like those contentious politics are certainly playing out.
But process-wise, there is an opportunity for the license grantor to take community concerns into consideration.
Yeah. And I think they all are approved at the state level. I mean, there's a Chicago layer first, but then Illinois is the. I'm mixing up my readings, but I'm pretty sure that overall there's like an Illinois database where you can check these and see that they've been approved.
I know in the state of New York, their rollout of like legal cannabis was like notoriously bad because a lot of people who chose to pursue the legal route ended up getting left in the dust by businesses that called themselves smoke shops, but ended up just selling like marijuana. Did you find any cases of that when you were looking at Chicago? And because I think instead of like what's happening in Canada where they just call themselves dispensaries.
Yeah, I don't know all the details of New York, but I do remember reading the headline, like it's not working and this is why. I'm not sure how to best build a parallel to New York. What I can say is there are a few instances of consumption cafes happening, and those are not legal in either Toronto or Chicago. The Chicago ones are interesting so they're not in our data because we only looked at dispensaries. However, there's a couple of consumption cafes in Chicago that are only selling those hemp-derived THC products. And so, yeah, you can go and get like a can of beverage and like hang out and consume it. Again, they're operating in that very gray area where like this is just an unregulated product, right? It would be like going to a cafe to drink your friend's moonshine, but spending a bunch of money to do it there. In Toronto, we don't have any. You're not allowed to consume cannabis in public, though you will walk down the sidewalk and smell it absolutely everywhere. I think Chicago is the same. There's one dispensary that has gotten probably the most attention for violating this particular rule, where they are allowing on-site consumption, and the police they blockade it. They bring in these big cement boulders and like block the entrances and they just like people just like crawl around it or they carve it out. One time they actually trapped a tenant in the apartment building by trying to close the cafe. So I think these certain spaces are getting a lot of attention for on-site consumption. I don't think that's quite what's going on in New York, what happened in New York though. Yeah, thanks. I think you were, I think this person was first.
Hi, I know we're looking at Toronto and Chicago, but since we're looking at the cannabis and the psilocybins, are we taking a consideration of looking at Oregon and Colorado, since both of those states have,
yeah, they've been a little bit more liberal in their law. Yeah, so the way that I was thinking about this in the book is like Toronto and Chicago make sense for comparison just because of size, but they're also not the most progressive on this side of legalization, right? And so you have these cities like Denver and Portland, or the states of Colorado and Oregon kind of pushing this a little bit differently. In Canada, the equivalent would be Vancouver and British Columbia, right? So just kind of getting ahead of medical marijuana a little bit faster, creating like municipal rules to create infrastructure. And those in those places, in those cities, that their transition into like the legal dispensary market seems to have gone smoother because they're like, let's get on top of this before the recreational legalization passes. So I do think there's a case to look at, like, where does this policy have like kind of have the best effects on like the kind of unregulated, unlicensed territory. And I think we can look at those cases, but the magic mushroom dispensaries in Oregon are illegal. So you can buy it, but again, the context there is like this: with a psychiatrist and in a clinical setting, you can get a special permit to do an experimental medical treatment. And obviously, like, Kennedy is like pushing this, right? Like there's a federal conversation around the medical uses of these products that is really making this research hard to think about, because it used to be so clear and it's not clear anymore. But that actually maybe that's the argument, is like, as we have more legal ambiguity, like these entrepreneurs are going to just take advantage of it. I didn't answer your question, but
Hi, so thank you first for coming out. My question was more about the illicit businesses, like all the magic mushrooms that's popping up, and also the illicit, like unregulated, did you say?
some of them are, yeah,
Yes,
unlicensed and
unlicensed.
illicit. They're, yeah,
So,
I'm treating those as kind of the same.
Yeah, what do you think is it, or what do you think, what have you found that makes it so easy for them to pop up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this, certainly the legalization limbo, right? Where when you start to get political commitments from someone, like, oh, we're going to change this policy, then these entrepreneurs want to be the first, right? They want to get the customer base, they want to get the space, they want to start building the reputation, or they were already doing it, but through mail order, and they're like, I've got the stuff, let's just get a storefront, right? So I think that legalization limbo seems to be creating a lot of space for some risk taking. But in Toronto now, because we have fully legalized markets, like, why do we still have unlicensed dispensaries? And there, it seems to mostly be like an oversaturation story. Like, we just have so many that people are like, no one's going to notice if I open up one more. We don't have enough bylaw officers to be investigating the 300 dispensaries that might be in Toronto on a given day. And they're closing and opening and bouncing around the city so quickly. I mean, you can walk down a block and you'll see 3 closed dispensaries in like a popular part of Toronto. So yeah, I think that the sort of, as policies and laws are churning and changing, it just creates this opportunity for entrepreneurs to sort of take on some risks if they're willing to. And again, a lot of these, for the magic mushrooms, the owners are not in the city getting arrested. They live abroad. Like, they're investors, they're buying it up, or they're coming, setting up shop, and then leaving. So it's hard to tell. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Caramel, and I just had a quick question about how can you tell like the difference between, like, if there was one next to the other, kind of like if I was 19 and I was looking for one, to know to go to one that's actually licensed. Like, is there not for me, but
you wouldn't know. You would, I mean, again, when this was in I'll show you the photo of my neighborhood. You're just walking down the street. You're like, okay, like, because it's legal in Canada, like, wouldn't you just go here and then be like, oh, I guess I'll go here as well? The only way, you would have to go to the Ontario like Commission's website, be like, oh, there's one. Let me check. Is Alpha Bud Cannabis on Sherbourne Street licensed? Oh, it's not. Let me go find the next one. Interestingly, with the dispensaries here, you can't see it in this photo because it's a little bit dark. It's locked. You can't just walk in. There's a buzzer system and a video system at all of these. So you walk up, it's a totally locked door. You buzz, and you like talk to a camera and be like, yeah, what do you want? You know, like, think they're making sure police aren't coming, or and then they'll buzz you in. They might have you hold up your ID. It does say 19 plus right here, but wouldn't have to say 19 plus. They just decided they would do that for maybe for a little bit less harassment that day. But yeah, I mean, I think your question is exactly why we thought this would be interesting to look at, because we really want to be thinking about your average consumer walking down a sidewalk in the face of an illicit market. And as a customers, you wouldn't necessarily know that you're participating in an illicit market. And especially in a context where it's legal in one context, but this one's unlicensed, and then completely illegal in another context. So it's kind of like it can be in your face and you as a customer not even knowing.
Are you aware of any like business implications for Toronto dispensaries that choose to be licensed? Because I know in California, cannabis is taxed pretty highly,
Yeah.
and also like maybe like a licensing fee or other things similar to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the unlicensed dispensaries, especially the indigenous owned ones that are getting a lot of calls, are complaining that the licensed business owners are the ones reporting them. Right. So it's like, and I've seen newspaper interviews with a licensed business owner being like, we're following the rules. We're trying to turn a profit. It's hard. We're paying everything. Why are they getting to skip all of this? So of course I'm reporting them. So there's like a big tension between the licensed and unlicensed dispensaries. However, I did just check this morning because I had forgotten about this paper. So there was a paper that came out in 2025 showing that in Canada, 78% of all cannabis products are now within the legal market. So they're the Canadian produced markets. So part of this story too is like, when does the policy work? And in some ways, even though I'm showing you all this unlicensed stuff, the reality is most cannabis consumers are buying legal products overseen by the country, purchasing them at licensed dispensaries if they can tell that it's a licensed dispensary. But even the unlicensed dispensaries it's easier to get legal product than illegal product in Canada. So in terms of where our cannabis is coming from, it has put a huge damper on the illicit production side of things.
Kind of a follow-up question to like the licensing. I know like at least like in restaurants we have like food grade. I don't know what they're called, but like outside the restaurants you like grade A or whatever. I wonder like if there's any like current policies like or like upcoming ones that might have to do with like maybe like a visual like stamp outside that could indicate to like consumers.
Are you talking about like the licenses, like the businesses, or the products?
Maybe like a combination of both, but specifically like I know in restaurants people can see like I don't know what it's called, but some sort of like certification from the city that says like grade A for sanitary something.
Yeah, held
and I
like an
wonder.
inspection. So the legal product in Canada, it's really interesting because all the packaging is standardized. There's no logos allowed. You can have a brand name, but the font can only be this big. All of the packaging is really, really uniform. And then it has this big there's like a THC symbol on it, and then there's like something about approved by Canada. So we do have that in Canada. I don't know about Illinois. I'm not sure how they're distinguishing like the legal product from the illegal product. And certainly in the hemp-derived THC market, those products have like no standards whatsoever. I mean, you can buy a beverage with 1,000 milligrams of THC that's like synthesized from hemp. I imagine that like showing the licensing and not would be easy to do. But again, back to if you're an average customer, may I see your license, please? Are you in compliance with all the rules and regulations? Like that's just not what customers are thinking about. That would really only be something that the bylaw officers would be looking at. I mean, you certainly could put it there. I don't think it's required. But maybe it could be, right? And again, but even if it were required, I don't think it would change this, right? Like at least in the current oversaturated market where we certainly don't have enough, there's just not being enforced. We don't have enough resources to enforce the growth of this illicit market. I think Lexi had a question.
So I'm just thinking about expanding this research and how you went from cannabis to magic mushrooms, which is really interesting because it's completely unregulated, unlicensed. So I was just thinking about like in your research on that, have you noticed other kinds of businesses or entrepreneurs trying to capitalize on like, oh, this is in limbo, so I can open this up and nothing will happen to me. I'm thinking specifically of like Kratom. I don't know if you've heard anything about those kinds of places opening up.
It's such a good question, Lexi. And I was on, so some of the magic mushroom dispensaries in Toronto are chains. It's like Fun Guys, Shroomies, and Mush Love. And if you go on their website, they do have other products. I can't read, and they're those, yeah, they're like I don't think it was ketamine, but it was like that kind of style of stuff. And you're like, is really? But then it would be like mail order. It's unclear if it was like mail order or if you could buy it at the store. But it does certainly seem like this class of substances that are sort of, I don't know, maybe there's like a larger cultural acceptance around experimenting with them, especially for like these medical uses, seem to be what's the focus here, right? It's not crack, it's not meth, but it's just this other, like this certain, like these, these classifications of substances where there's pushback. And a lot, I don't know if I've mentioned this, I'm sorry. They're saying that this is a medical protest. So because there are 300 patients in Canada who have that experimental with a psychiatrist, I can use magic mushrooms, they're like, I'm providing the supply because Canada's not providing a supply. So the owners of these are like, this is a medical protest, which was what the early cannabis dispensaries in Canada were saying as well.
So we have 300 customers across
all of Canada, but we have 20 of these in Toronto. Yeah, but I need to look into like what is being offered, because like what they're advertising is it's bigger than what they're advertising is not all they offer. Yeah.
Final question.
Hi, Dr. Smith. My name is Jazz. I'm a Dean's Ambassador here with the School of Public Policy. And I just want to say this was an amazing presentation.
Thank you.
So thank you, first of all. So my question is within the local kind of economy. So as the market got oversaturated and these businesses were moving in to the area, how did that affect the businesses that were, well, it affected because they left, but what businesses left and how did that affect their local economy?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I've seen a little bit about this. And it's funny that you mentioned it because it would be so easy to study this, right? Like look at what was there on Google Maps prior to the dispensary. If you notice that timeline, I'll pop it up really quick. Remember the pandemic? Like this is 2020, like look what grew in Toronto during the pandemic. Cannabis dispensaries were considered, what was the phrase that we used? Like a necessary service?
Essential?
Yeah, it was an essential product. So you couldn't go to a restaurant, but you could go into a cannabis dispensary in 2020, and we had like 200 in Toronto. So what closed? A lot of it were like local shops, like locally owned shops, like gift shops, like kind of like fun, like little cafes or restaurants. At least that's what I remember in the neighborhoods that I was seeing. Now I'm just shocked by the empty storefronts. I lived in this one neighborhood and there were 3 empty former cannabis dispensaries just boarded up, like with 4 lease signs on them. And some of the market specialists have been writing about sort of this like bubble in Toronto, pointing out that a lot of business leases are 5 years. And so as businesses are in a spot of having to renew those leases and the market became so oversaturated, we might start to see this number decline post 2025. It's a little bit too early to know if that's happening, but it certainly, like, again, it's churning. It's like this is an unstable market, so it might be. I haven't seen anyone specifically look at like what's being pushed out, but what I have seen are kind of conversations about how, as an entrepreneur, you don't need a lot of square footage for these dispensaries, and you get really high revenue for a small bit of output, right? And so if you're like, storefront is super expensive in some of these like really popular commercial districts, but you don't need a lot. You just need you're not even allowed to have this out on a display. You don't even need a display case for a cannabis dispensary. It's all in a back room in Toronto. So you just need to have a desk and a back room. And so it really doesn't require a big like capital startup to be able to run a licensed dispensary. The kind of businesses that could have been there before might have been like an ice cream kiosk or like a small food stand where you're like not going to have that the profit coming out of such a small space that you would have with cannabis dispensaries. But yeah, that's a good question. That is one that's doable, unfortunately. Now I have to get back to data collection.
If I can add to that, one other thing we know by looking at gentrification studies is a lot of times they push out like mom and pop restaurants and shops, right? And so we know some of the neighborhoods are gentrifying.
Yes.
And where these are popping up or have already gentrified, but that's something we can look at.
Yeah.
Maybe we don't know exactly what's leaving, but we can draw parallels to that.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Thanks.
Okay, I think that's it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for the questions.